Philosophical comment about ancient names and the Tetragrammaton. Some scholars suppose that the ineffable name of God was not rediscovered by Hebrew scholars, Kabbalists, until 300 AD. I will post a link to one modern pastor's research on the Tetragrammaton. That's at www.jesus-messiah.com studies/. This isn't a threat on the pro-con of Faith 4 itself. To a certain extent, that is something like the partisan points in Congress or whatever. Dr. Record's article on the Indo-European origins of the word Yahweh is worth reading. There are, of course, numerous avenues of approach for words from Proto-Indo-European Ukrainian languages drifting into Sanskrit and Syrian terminology, cultural transmissions of ideas about the origin of ideas of God, and the linguistic and cultural ideas about gods, lowercase, in the singular or plural, are valuable for historical learning. Yet ideas about God that one might have for oneself are not solely dependent upon an historical cultural transmission. One may consider God's attributes philosophically, as Aquinas did. God and his relation to the universe or cosmos may be regarded with logical thought for some, many have. Rosenberg, in his biography of Abraham, wrote that Elohim arose as a term for God in an area with a tradition of three pagan gods. Evidently, some of the earlier writings and knowledge of the J and P writers about the court of Solomon and Rehoboam were then lost and unknown to the northern court a couple hundred years later. I recommend reading Rosenberg's excellent book. He traces Abraham's route from Sumer up the Euphrates over to Jerusalem and his meeting with the Jebusites in Melchizedek. The cultural transmissions through history are valid enough to have historical value. There is an oral tradition in the Middle East and of song that is said to still be influential. Abraham's migration to Israel and development of a personal relationship with God evolved into what was in effect a new people culturally that believed in God. Abraham, Rosenberg said, was the first Jew. One may associate numerous cultural references to comprehension of ancient times and points of religious interest. I've read history and philosophy simultaneously, more or less, including ancient history, for a few decades. The depth in history leads me to expand understanding and not to approach ancient meanings and circumstances illogically, as if the events, processes, or math formula might be proven or disproved necessarily. Also read items translated into English by scholars. I had only a little reading of Hebrew and the biblical languages. Cultural memories of Martin Frobisher's explorations continued in the Bay from his early 16th century encounter with Inuit until recent times, so far that locations of archaeologically valuable sites were rediscovered with their tribal memory of the locations. Ancient Jewish history was also perpetuated until the development of the Aleph Beth, perhaps in the 15th century before Christ. When King David made Jerusalem his capital, the accumulated scripts were probably brought together in his court. The J writer, along with her knowledge of ancient Babylonian and Sumerian cultural traditions, was able to put together the book of Genesis, perhaps adding the flood story to it from the Abrahamic heritage. Obviously, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was possible to compare the text and textual inconsistencies of the scripture of different eras, and there weren't many. It is probable that the ancient Persian Gulf, about 15,000 BC, had a much lower sea level, and that ancient cultures formed farther out in locations that today are under 200 feet of water. There was hence much cause for flood story. There is much scholarship on biblical history, so much that one may take one's course through making an image of the ancient world's history. It seems that many non-believers want to find some linguistic point or an historical reconstruction as a point to dispute the existence of God. I have found ample reason historically to have faith in God that is reinforced by logical, philosophical reasoning about the nature of God. In order philosophically to consider the universe as a contingent element within God's purposes, it may be necessary to actually have a belief that God is actual, rather than dismissing that a priori.